Hi, everybody. It's Dean Cohen, and I want to welcome you back to another one of our conversations. It's a very great pleasure for me today to introduce David Miliband. Um, David Miliband is the president of the International Rescue Committee. Before that, he had a truly stellar career in British politics. He served as foreign secretary from 2007 to 2010, which is, I believe, when we first met. I was working for Secretary Rice, and I often had the opportunity to be sitting behind her as she engaged with the foreign secretary on a whole host of issues. I think we took at least one trip to Afghanistan together, which I vividly remember. And since then, we've been in touch. So I'm just so pleased that he's willing to join us. As we usually do these things, I'm going to have about half an hour or so of conversation with David Miliband, and then I'll open the floor up for questions. Please put questions in the Q&A. Our experience is it tends to get a little bit crowded, so the sooner you put your thoughts in there, the quicker I'll get to them. Please put your name there. And as always, I privilege student questions first, but chances are we'll get around to lots of others as well. So, David, welcome. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thanks, Elliot. Very nice to be with you.
So,
sort of with you, not really. It'd be nicer to be with you, properly with you.
Well, I really do wish I was welcoming you to to SAIS in our physical presence, but those days are coming, but unfortunately they're not here yet. So I thought if we could just begin a little bit about your own biography. So you started off in British politics in the Labour Party. Could you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I'm maybe older than I look. So in the late 1980s, I was asked by the then Institute for Public Policy Research, which was a think tank founded by people who were concerned that Labour had made a world record specialism of losing elections and wanted to do something about it, to try and develop a modern social democratic program. And then after the 92 election, which was our fourth election defeat in a row, the then party leader, John Smith, asked me to be the secretary of something called the Commission on Social Justice, which was to rethink our approach to the welfare state 40, 50 years after Beveridge and the Second World War. And then John tragically died in 94, and just before the Commission on Social Justice was published, report was published, Tony Blair said, well, I've heard of this guy. I don't really know him that well, but he seems to have something about him. And he asked me to come and run his policy shop, really, domestic policy shop. He was then leader of the opposition after 94. And it was simple, really. We had to dump the baggage and nurture the magic. And that's what we did in 97 election. I wrote the manifesto for that, was involved in the subsequent manifestos, but then to my own surprise, became a member of parliament. And then in the Brown government, was Minister for Schools and various other things. And then Gordon Brown gave me the privilege of being Foreign Minister, Foreign Secretary, Secretary of State, the 74th Secretary of State of the UK, in which I had the occasion to spend 18 months at the end of the second Bush administration working with Condi Rice, and then 18 months at the beginning of the Obama administration working with Hillary Clinton. And so that was a really remarkable period. And obviously we were at what now looks like a hinge in history, because that was the time of the global financial crisis. And it was just at the moment as the Chinese system was gaining in confidence about its own thinking and the way in which it wanted to position itself for the world, just before Xi Jinping came into power. And since 2013, the electorate cut off my political career in 2010 twice over. First with we were voted out of government, voted out of office. The Labour government was voted out of office, not yet to return. And then I lost the leadership election of the Labour Party. I was still a member of parliament, obviously, in our system, but had this remarkable stroke of luck in 2013 as I was strumming my fingers on the table, wondering how I could square my determination to speak up without looking like a divisive figure in politics. This chance to put my experience and values into practice came up at the International Rescue Committee, which is this extraordinary charity founded by Albert Einstein in the 1930s to rescue Jews from Europe, now a global humanitarian charity. And I pitched to the interview committee that some of the questions at the intersection of foreign policy and humanitarian affairs are some of the most difficult questions in global public life. How do you get medical aid into Syria? How do you teach education in Afghanistan? How do you tackle sexual violence in Congo? So I said, I like difficult problems. Secondly, the IRC was a bit of a sleeping giant. We were a $400 million organization at the time, but very few people. It was a well-kept secret. And I felt it had a responsibility as a charity that was focused on people whose lives are shattered by conflict and disaster and persecution to be a thought leader. And then thirdly, my own parents had been refugees from Belgium and Poland to the UK. So there was a closing of the circle. And for those reasons, and since the end of 2013, I've been had the great good fortune to lead an extraordinary team of people in what is now an $850 million organization in 200 field sites around the world. So that's the quick tour of how we got here.
It's quite a...
And obviously the biggest thing is that in 2015, I gave the graduation speech at SAIS. No greater honor could anyone be.
Yes, no, I'm sure that was the pinnacle of your career.
Maybe someone can put it in the chat or something.
Yeah.
The text.
Well, let's see. Actually, Danielle, if you're out there, why don't you see if you can dig it up? That's an extraordinary career. I will note that the Labour Party did not win any elections after you departed from the leadership and actually went to a pretty, in some ways, to a pretty dark place, I would argue, under Jeremy Corbyn.
Yeah.
But before we go to the IRC, which I do want to go up, is obviously what we're going to be talking about. How do you explain that?
The Labour situation.
Yeah, what happened to the Labour Party?
Well, I think the simple answer is that it got caught in a no man's land between embracing our time in government and rejecting our time in government, when the truth is you need to build on your time in government. And it got into this false debate in which we effectively trashed our own record. We allowed ourselves to become detached from the concerns of the voters. And we lost both the need for credibility and the need for radicalism. And we ended up with an incredible program, which of course is by definition not radical at all, because if it's not going to change anything, then it's not going to count for anything. And that's very simplistic. There's a lot more going on. The rise of Scottish nationalism is an important feature of the fragmentation of UK politics. Historically, Labour's been very strong in Scotland. We've lost, out of the 50-odd seats in Scotland, we've lost all but a handful of them. And there's obviously the process also, which has been in the news recently, of the de-alignment between traditional working class communities and centre-left parties, which is not just a feature of the UK. You've got some of that going on here. Yeah. So I don't want to oversimplify, but I think that we've spent 10 years in that no man's land, 11 years now, and the electorate are screaming at us pretty clearly that when we put up candidates who are incredible in their eyes and not able to meet their needs, they'll vote against you. And we shouldn't be surprised.
You know, just last question, then we will go to the IRC. Do you see this as part of a larger crisis in liberal democratic governance with large parties that are in serious trouble? I was speaking to a friend of mine who's quite high up in the Biden administration, and we're talking about the parlous state of American politics. As you probably know, once upon a time I was a Republican, no longer. I'm now I'm not quite suitable for the IRC, but I am a homeless person from a political point of view. And, you know, his comment was, he said, the Republicans are in really pretty desperate straits. He said, I'm not so sure about my own party in the long run. I mean, for the moment, we're holding it together more, but I worry about the dysfunctionality of our two great parties. And there's a kind of stability here, as in a somewhat different way there was in the UK, from having a multi-party system, but that was, you know, based on two big parties that dominate. So I'm just curious, do you see this as a larger issue?
Yes. I mean, the short answer is yes. There's obviously the eating away of the centre-left vote by nationalists and green movements, by sometimes compassionate conservatives, by populist conservatives, and also in some places by the hard left. So that's going on the centre left. But there's also, I think, a real crisis of conservatism. the Conservative Party in Britain has done something revolutionary in Brexit. It's not a conserving of institutions. It's a revolutionary thing. And there is a sort of brand of right-wing Trotskyism that's taking place in a number of places. That is, I mean, I'm a social democrat, not a conservative, so I'm centre-left rather than centre-right. But I do think that the liberal democratic competitive politics has become very fragmented in the multi-party systems, and in the two-party systems, which essentially is what the US is, and significantly the UK is, although in Scotland and Wales it's multi-party. I think that both sides are being eaten up, and that is the result of structural forces as well as contingent decisions. And that's what makes, I think, it very, very serious.
Something tells me you and I could have a long conversation about this, because I think it is one of the central issues of our time. But let's move to the IRC. It is very striking to me that, you know, you're the son of immigrants. I think that the closer one is to an immigrant/refugee experience, the more it affects you. I mean, my grandparents were in that category, but so less direct, but still there. Let me ask you this. You know, so you mentioned the history of the IRC being founded by Einstein to support Jewish refugees in the 30s. You know, it has always struck me that organizations have a kind of DNA about them. So, how would you characterize the DNA of the International Rescue Committee?
I mean, I think the DNA is the temptation is to go to Einstein for the DNA, but I would prefer to go to Idlib, or I'd prefer to go to Helmand in Afghanistan, or I'd prefer to go to the Kivus in eastern DRC, because most of the people who work for us, 95% of the people who work for us, are recruited in those places. Now, we're also the largest refugee resettlement agency in the United States, in 25 offices. So I would also say, let's go to Boise, Idaho. Let's go to Salt Lake City. Let's go to Los Angeles or New York. And in there, I would find real practical intelligence. I think that's the DNA of the IRC. It's, just to give you an example, it's people who, there are 800 people in Greece. They've walked 40 kilometers from landing on the shore. There isn't, they need to get 40 kilometers, sorry, to the UN registration site. They've walked 8. There's meant to be a bus and there's no bus. The IRC finds out about it, and it manages to, and I'm telling this because I've seen it, the staff manage to sort out the people between those who need immediate medical care and those who don't, those who are unaccompanied children and those who aren't, those who can fend for themselves and those who can't. It organizes the bus schedule. It gets the treatment where it's needed. And by the way, because I had these conversations, there are diabetics without proper insulin. There are cancer patients without proper treatment. There are pregnant women who need support. So it's not just about organizing a bus. And they organize the bus in such a way that there are 800 people there, but they don't all try and jump on the first bus. It's orderly, it's organized, it's respectful, it's dignified. And so I think the DNA of the IRC is practical intelligence. Now, I think there's a danger in the modern world that we think that practical intelligence can speak for itself, but actually it can't. To be an operational leader, we argue you have to be a thought leader as well, and we have to take the lessons from our work with refugees in Greece, or our work with malnourished kids in South Sudan, or our work with victims of gender-based violence almost anywhere, actually, in Myanmar or in Bangladesh. We've got to take that and we've got to broadcast it to a global audience, or at least to a larger audience. And so it's where I hope we'll become is a charity, an NGO that gains strength from its focus. We're not just a general anti-poverty agency. We work across the arc of crisis, from the war zone to the internally displaced, the refugees, and then the resettlement in America. We're across that arc. We work in 40 countries, not 140 countries. We've got operational smarts, but we're also a thinking NGO. And we take the lessons and try and influence the way the big players in the global system work. So sorry for the long answer, but
No,
that's the way I try and express it.
This is fascinating. How many people do you have working for you?
So that's interesting. We now have about 14,000 employees and 18,000 volunteers who are, they're called volunteers, but that doesn't mean they're working without pay. I mean, they're working, they're incentive workers, if you like. So we're quite a large organization now. Obviously, the hardest thing in an NGO is to raise funds for the back office. No one wants to pay for the computer system. No one wants to pay for the HR. No one wants to pay for safety and security. So we've got a job to make sure that we can meet our commitments to program quality, to outcome and evidence-based work, to cost effectiveness as well as cost efficiency. And you know, that's a struggle, and getting that operational and programmatic balance right is a massive thing. But I'm really, if anyone goes to the IRC website, rescue.org, they'll see clients and staff speaking about what we're doing. They'll also see statistics about what we're doing, and that transparency, I think, is really important.
So what is you know, it's funny, I've been giving money to the IRC for as long as I remember.
Thank you very much. That's very much appreciated.
Pretty modest amounts.
Well, you can give more as a result of this.
I'll be giving more after this. I don't doubt. I had no idea that just how large it was. How does an organization like IRC, and then I'm going to want us to go into the substance of the world that we're now in, how does an organization like IRC decide, you know, what are the things that we do as opposed to what are the things that governments do? Do you step in when governments are simply failing?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Are there the kinds of things that governments just don't do that you do? How, and also then how do you divide up work with, you know, you're not the only charitable organization out there that does this kind of thing. How do you guys decide who's going to do what?
That's a really good question. And in all seriousness, thank you for your support. That is meaningful. Look, I'm very proud that we have strict entry and exit criteria. So we'll only work somewhere if 3 conditions are met. A, that there is real crisis or threat of crisis. And just because there's poverty doesn't mean that we need to be there. So we're in Pakistan, but we're not in India, to make the point. We're in Bangladesh, we're not in Sri Lanka. Second point, that there is poverty and vulnerability rising. So we've now left Rwanda because it's a development context. Thirdly, and directly to your point, we only work where someone else isn't doing a better job. And in some places that might be the government, although in most of the places we work, government is a combatant in the local conflict, and that creates all sorts of issues. But it might be an NGO, it might be a local NGO, it might be UNICEF or a UN agency, because the UN agencies are both funders and fundraisers and delivery agencies. So it's complicated. But we don't have 3 of us turning up in the same place to do a livelihoods program, because there is something called the UN cluster system, which tries to make sure that, and generally succeeds in making sure that we don't end up going to the same place. Now, here's a big misconception. People think, well, I've got now $850 million and I'm deciding, well, we'll spend this much in Bangladesh and we'll spend this much in Syria. It doesn't work like that. 3/4 of our money comes from governments. So there are bureaucracies deciding we want to do a program in Bangladesh and we don't want to do a program in Syria. And then we apply for the grant to deliver it. Now, 25% of our money comes from individuals, foundations, and corporations. We've more or less doubled that percentage in the last 7 years, which gives us a bit more flexibility, because generally private sector support is longer term and it's got less strings and bureaucracy attached to it. But essentially, I'm not making the decisions about where governments are going to prioritize. Other people do that. What we're making decisions about is whether to bid for it. So a country program of Syria or a country program in DRC will decide, well, we're going to go for this because, you know, we've got our outcomes and evidence framework. Anyone who's interested can go, and if they type into Google IRC outcomes and evidence framework, they'll see the way in which we judge what works in the humanitarian sector and what we do best. And that's what our country directors see as well. And that's what guides us in deciding whether or not to apply for a grant.
That's fascinating. And can you generalize in some way about how long you're likely to stay in one country, or is it just completely variable?
Well, too long is the short answer, because you're a esteemed and diplomat. We've got a crisis of diplomacy when it comes to civil wars.
Yeah.
The average length of a civil war is more or less doubled or tripled or quadrupled in the last. There's a book by David, can't remember his name, who's called Civil Wars, who's got the statistics. And essentially the tools of diplomacy that you and I understand for interstate diplomacy are not, and actually the philosophies that are applied to interstate diplomacy are not very well tuned to intrastate conflict.
Yeah.
Don't mess with internal affairs. Well, where does that leave you in the Syria case? Where does that leave you in the South Sudan case? Where it leaves the civilians is getting killed. And so we stay a long time. We've been in Afghanistan, which you know very well, since the 1970s. And on one hand, I say that with pride. On the other hand, I say that with regret, because it means that things have remained very bad.
No, it is a different kind of diplomacy. For I'm not quite sure what reason, I've been reading a lot of modern Turkish history recently, including about the period of the Armenian genocide. And you see external actors, including the Germans, but also most notably the Americans, trying to deal with that with traditional diplomacy, and they're not able to do it really. So let's talk about the substance. So am I correct in assuming that you think that we're actually in a period with the kinds of crises that elicit the IRC's response getting worse?
Yes, I should have probably said this earlier, that the title of this session is about the refugee crisis, which is an important part of what we do, although it's important to have a few numbers. I mean, I know Stalin said that one man's death is a tragedy, a million people's death is a statistic, so I'm wary of that, but I'm going to throw a lot of millions at you. But I think it is important just because it'll explicate something. 35 million people driven from their home country, so crossing a border as a result of war and conflict and persecution. About 31 million, 32 million as qualified as refugees, so they've been granted refugee status either by the UN or by the country concerned. 3.5 million asylum seekers, so they're still trying to claim refugee status, but 35 million. 45 million internally displaced, so homeless within their own country. So just to give you an example of what that means, there are 5.5 million, 6 million refugees from Syria, 3 million, 3.5 million in Turkey, 1 million in Lebanon, 500,000 in Jordan, 750,000 or 1 million in Germany. Internal displacement, 8 million in Syria. And in the Idlib province, which is in the northwest of the country, where 4.25 million people live, 1 million of those have been displaced from other parts of Syria in the last 10 years. So that's internal displacement. So 35 million refugees, 45 million refugees and asylum seekers, 45 million internally displaced, 80 million people, more than 1% of the world's population, in other words, displaced by conflict and persecution. Not, and we'll come back to whether this is a difference without substance, but not economic migrants. And the definition of refugee is someone who has a well-founded fear of persecution. That's the 1951 convention. The way I would put that more colloquially is someone for whom it's not safe to go home. So if you're afraid of being dragooned into Assad's army, it's not safe to go home. If you're afraid of being targeted by a gang in El Salvador, it's not safe to go home. If you're a woman being beaten up by your husband or other people, it's not safe to go home. So someone who's fled their country and isn't able to go home is a refugee, not an economic migrant. And the numbers of economic migrants are obviously much larger. Now, the increase in the number of refugees is more or less 50%, 40% since I started 6-7 years ago. And the number of IDPs is at record levels as well, internal displaced. And just to give you a sense, I asked my team, just remind me, the 5 countries of origin responsible for 67%, so 2/3 of all refugees come from the following 5 countries: Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan, South Sudan, Myanmar. The top 5 countries of destination is interesting: Turkey, Colombia, Pakistan, Uganda, Germany. And then the top 5 countries with conflict-related internal displacement, so the IDP figure: Syria, 6.5 million, like I said. I think I said 8 million, 6.5 million it says here. Colombia, DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, Yemen, 3.6 million, Afghanistan, 3 million from conflict, 1.2 million in addition from natural disasters. And those are people, in the case of the refugees, 60% of whom are in urban areas, not in camps. People often say to me, oh, you must work in refugee camps, and we do, but there's only about 4 or 5 million people in refugee camps these days. Most people are in urban areas. They're renting or begging or borrowing or living with relatives in urban areas. So it's a different geography. And sorry, a very long lecture, but the last part of the statistical snowstorm, the average length of displacement is completely different than when the Refugee Convention was created, because obviously the Second World War was a 6-year conflict. And it was in the light of the Second World War that the Refugee Convention was drawn up. Today, it's hard to get statistics, but we're talking multi-generational conflict, 15, 20, 25 years of displacement. And so the best way of thinking about it, less than 3% of the world's refugees went home last year. So that tells you that it's the hosting countries, which in the main are poor countries, not rich countries. You know, the debate in the US or in Europe is ridiculous, because it's the Bangladeshis of this world, it's the Ugandas of this world who are hosting most refugees, not the Americas and the UKs of this world. But people are out for a very long time, and so the sustainable solution has got to be to integrate them into local economic life and then query about whether they become citizens. Different countries take different approach to that.
Overwhelming and fascinating. Let me, by the way, just those of you out there listening, please put your questions in the Q&A, not the chat, and I'll be getting to those in a moment. So let me ask you this question. Those are daunting statistics. I'm not sure whether I'm asking you this question in your capacity as president of the IRC or as a former foreign secretary. Is there a systemic explanation for why the phenomenon has gotten a lot worse? Or is it just, okay, there was a terrible civil war in Syria, there was a kind of hideous breakdown of internal politics in Myanmar? In other words, should we be looking for some general pattern here that helps explain this, or would that be inappropriate?
I think we should be looking for a general pattern. And I wrote a book about this, so I've learned in America it's okay to flaunt one's publications. It's a book called Rescue Refugees and the Political Crisis of Our Time. And it's short, so it has much to commend it for that reason. And I thought about this, and I can't give you a single word explanation, but I think there are 4 explanatory variables for the increase in the number of refugees, and they are structural. To your point, they're long-term, not short-term. They're structural, not conjunctural. One is there's a large, growing number of what I would call fragile states around the world. Fragile, not in the World Bank economic sense, but in the political sense, that their political systems are unable to forge compromise across divisions of race and religion and region, ethnicity. So you've got a political part of the explanation about domestic politics in fragile states. A second part of the explanation is the global system and the gridlock nature of diplomacy in, let's be blunt about it, Syria because of the Russian attitude, Yemen because of the US attitude until recently. Global politics, far from being a key to unlock the answers to peaceful resolution, it's become a magnifier. The number of internationalized conflicts, the number of conflicts, civil wars in which there are external players has massively grown. Now, I just want to say straight away, I'm not naive. I know that the Cold War was marked by a lot of external intervention in civil wars, but we've not learned our lesson. Third part is quite difficult to talk about. One has to tread carefully, but it's striking to me that there is roiling conflict in important parts of the Islamic world, not all of it, but in important divisions. And we were founded as a secular agency by Albert Einstein, and but it's striking that about 45% of the places that we work are Muslim majority countries now. And you will have scholars and experts who will be able to speak to that. Some of that is divisions within countries. Some of it is intra-regional conflicts, so the Yemen example. And then the fourth, you're bound to ask about this, and I didn't give it enough play in my little book, is obviously climate is a conflict multiplier. Climate crisis is a conflict multiplier. Personally, I don't talk about climate refugees. And I don't because generally the people who are moved as a result of climate crisis don't cross borders. They are climate IDPs rather than refugees, but that's kind of pedantic on my part. But they are, there's undoubtedly a force multiplier, a conflict multiplier, because climate crisis increases resource stress, and the resource stress drives conflict.
Well, I'm going to belatedly turn to the Q&A. I could easily go on my own. I'm going to begin with Justin Marcello. Structural innovations and changes in the humanitarian system often emerge in response to major crises. This is the 10th anniversary of the Syrian crisis. How has Syria in particular, and I think this is a very good question, changed the IRC's approach to humanitarian crises? But more broadly, I think Justin is also asking, what reforms must the humanitarian sector, so I guess peer institutions, make in order to improve the response to crises like that of Syria?
Well, I'll just mention 3 ways in which Syria has changed the way we work inside Syria. 1, lots more remote management, because it's very hard to get there. Secondly, lots more use of partner organizations, which really helps us reach places that we wouldn't otherwise reach. And thirdly, the most interesting thing in some ways, some of our best customer feedback mechanisms in Syria, perhaps necessity being the mother of invention, but I'm so proud of the way we really listen to our clients about what they want, how they rate the services, what they want to see get better. So that's just the way it's affected us. How has Syria affected the global system? Nowhere near enough, Elliot. Nowhere near enough. I mean, the global system is chasing its tail, not reforming itself. And I could sort of bore for Britain about this, but let me just give you a few examples. First of all, I talk a lot about the age of impunity. I mean, Syria is the poster child for impunity in the global system, our own staff getting killed, civilians being targeted, no accountability. UN inquiries blocked, Bellingcat and New York Times doing much more work on what is on acts of impunity than UN inquiries. Secondly, on the humanitarian side, for the countries supporting refugees, I'm thinking Jordan, I'm thinking Lebanon, I'm thinking Turkey to a lesser extent, I'm thinking Iraq to a much lesser extent. Really very bad failure on the part of the global system to recognize that Jordan and Lebanon, to take 2 examples, are delivering a global public good of supporting refugees. I could have told you in 2013, 14 that there was an explosion coming, and sure enough there was. And it ended up on the shores of Europe. So weak support for refugee hosting countries. Thirdly, humanitarian development systems not working in a coordinated way. We talk a lot in the IRC about outcomes. Until you have shared outcomes for an actor, be it a development actor or a humanitarian actor, be it a government or an NGO, be it a UN institution or a local body, unless there's alignment behind a set of outcomes, and we would pick out poverty, health, education, and equality for women or inequality for women as the 4 key guideposts. And without shared accountability, you're not going to get real sustained change. So 10 years later, 250,000 kids in Lebanon who are Syrian still not in education because there aren't the right systems to join the humanitarian and development efforts together. Fourthly, and don't worry, there isn't going to be a 14thly on this. Fourthly, 2/3 of our clients are women and girls. Women and girls face structural and multiple inequalities in the places that we work, and there is not proper recognition of the extra needs of women and girls. So when the UN COVID appeal came round, 30 UN agencies contributed, only one of them highlighted gender-based violence, yet we know that gender-based violence goes, and how many politicians have made speeches about this. So a real frustration that there hasn't been a catching up. And one of our big points is that the Sustainable Development Goals, which I'm sure people at SAIS study, are off track in fragile states, even before COVID, in significant part because those kind of issues that I've raised aren't being properly addressed.
Fascinating. I mean, depressing. Let me ask, we have one of our mid-career students, Julian Soika. How should developed countries react to the increased number of refugees, and what could they do on a structural basis to stabilize regions in crisis? Maybe if you could address that, and I'm going to ask a more pointed follow-up to that.
Well, I mean, refugee resettlement, which is a small part of the overall refugee response in which we do in the US, is an important part of the equation for the most vulnerable, widows, victims of torture, etc. But the vast majority of people aren't going to be resettled in rich countries. And frankly, the vast majority of people don't want to be resettled in rich countries. I mean, the time you can get Syrians to smile is when you ask them whether or not they'll ever go home. And they say they hope so, inshallah. So I think that the question of how to support refugee hosting states is a grade A question, and I don't want to oversimplify. But one, if you don't recognize that host populations are poor, as well as refugees being poor, you've got a big problem. So there needs to be support, not just for refugees, but for the host populations. I mean, Jordan has 25, 30% unemployment rate among the Jordanian population. So you don't want to build up animosity. And actually, one reason for supporting cash distribution as the best first response to a refugee crisis is that it supports the local economy as well as the refugees. Secondly, refugees need to be allowed to work, but if you're going to get them to work, you've got to have macroeconomic support from the international financial institutions. The World Bank has changed a lot under Jim Kim. We need the IMF to change. We need a much more systematic effort to support the refugee hosting states because of this global public good idea. Larry Summers has written about this from his Council on Global Development position. Thirdly, I think that in addition to the economic integration that is essential, you've got to recognize what a load is placed on the hosting states on the social side as well. And so they need support on the social side too, because if you don't give that support, then people will move again. And that's what's happening in South America, frankly. People are, our estimate, why do people trek 2,000 or 3,000 miles from, or kilometers from El Salvador? It's not just because they want to leave El Salvador, it's that they don't find anywhere to stop on the way. And that's dangerous for them, and it's not really a sustainable solution. So it's easier there are lots of no regrets moves. Just final point, I don't want to pretend it's easy, because it's not easy. The politics is very difficult, but the policy is not easy either.
Okay, here's the more pointed part of that. I mean, Syria has now come up a number of times. There were a number of us who were critical of the Obama administration for basically maintaining a hands-off position on Syria. Of course, Great Britain, like the United States, after the experiences in Afghanistan and Iraq, acquired an understandable allergy to interventions in those kinds of cases. But would you agree, there's only so much that organizations like the IRC can do, and you're in the position of the emergency room team trying to patch up a bleeding patient and stabilize them so that they have some chance of surviving, when other kinds of engagement, possibly in some cases even including military engagement, although that should be a last resort, are also needed? Or would that be pushing it too far?
Well, look, we are certainly dealing with the symptoms, not the causes, and that's a frustration. definitely frustrating. Some of what we do has long-term positive effects, but we're dealing with the. It wasn't a particularly pointed question, actually, unless I'm.
Well,
I mean, are you trying to get me to say, would I support military intervention, or?
No, but I understand it could be construed that way.
I mean, so first point, we are very much dealing with the symptoms, and that is frustrating, definitely. We are, in that sense, agenda takers, not agenda setters, certainly at the macro level. Secondly, we're all scarred by Iraq and Afghanistan. My take, which is not a surprise since I was saying it in government, is that no military strategy, no diplomatic strategy, no development strategy, no humanitarian strategy will work without a political settlement to which it's trying to head. And I'm increasingly of the view that in most of the cases we work in, that's a national and local political settlement, but also a regional. And that's complicated politics. And it needs to be sustained, but all the places that we work, really, they have regional effects as well as, and regional actors as well as local actors. Thirdly, we can't be imprisoned by the Iraq and Afghanistan experience. And I am leading a humanitarian organization, so I'm extremely careful in what I say, because I've got people on the ground. I don't want to get them into a difficult situation, but I think as a generic point, it'd be wrong to be imprisoned by that. It's a pity to me that humanitarian intervention is always seen as military, that people think of that, whereas there's a lot else that goes on before you get there. I think it's also worth pointing out that there has been a very quote-unquote successful military intervention recently, and that was the Russian intervention in Syria. And so they've undoubtedly changed the situation on the ground. Whether it's a step towards a solution is another matter. And I also would point out, and this is right at the edge of what I can say as a humanitarian leader, the 1,000 American troops in the northeast of Syria, their presence is a stabilizing factor at the moment. So I'm arguing about the status quo. I'm not arguing for an intervention, but I'm just saying to you that they are playing a stabilizing role. And so to the extent that I'm concerned about what's going to happen to our staff and our clients, I can't afford more instability. And holding the ring may not be heroic, but it may be important. It may not be a solution, but it's important. And obviously that everyone who knows anything about Afghanistan is worried about what's going to happen next. And I am sure that the people who made the decision are worried about what's going to happen next, because they're serious people.
Yeah. I must say there, I was thinking as you were speaking that there must be this interesting dialogue going on in your head between the foreign secretary and the head of a humanitarian organization.
Say to people,
I was just saying that there must be an interesting kind of internal dialogue in a certain way between the foreign secretary and the president of the IRC. And one of us is freezing. I'm not sure who it is. There we are.
Well, I've rejoined on my iPad. I have no idea what happened, but can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you and see you.
I'm sorry about that.
It's life.
You can see that I'm in my wife's study on the Upper West Side of New York. But I heard you ask about the Foreign Secretary dialogue and the humanitarian leader dialogue. And just to answer that briefly, one of the attractions of this job was precisely that, having looked from one end of the telescope as Foreign Minister, I'm now looking from the other end of the telescope as the NGO leader. As a Foreign Minister, you have more power, but more obstacles to getting anything done. As the NGO leader, you have less power, but fewer obstacles to getting things done. So it's a kind of an interesting balance.
Which job is more rewarding?
Oh, look, I never want to say anything other than what Madeleine Albright used to say, which is that there's no greater privilege than to represent your country. I mean, that's an unfair question in a way. I mean, I'm not offended by it, but it's you know what I mean.
It is, I understand.
But I think I'm very, very lucky to have the job I've got at the moment.
Yeah. We're going to go for another 5 minutes, since I always try to give people 5 minute break before, if they have 10 o'clock classes. A question from Anya Salama. How badly has the apparatus in the United States been dismantled for the acceptance of refugees? Let me broaden that out a bit and ask you, we obviously went through an administration which did not have a particularly deep interest, to put it mildly, in engaging with the question of refugees, and was considerably more inward looking. Could you speak in general to what impact that's had on first American institutional capacity, but also the American ability to lead?
Yeah, so on the institutional capacity, we had to close 3 offices, but we've sustained 25 offices. We expanded our work with victims of people trafficking, so consistent with our mission. Also some services to asylum seekers towards the southern border, consistent with the mission. And the scale of the reduction was monumental, remember. I mean, Ronald Reagan, I think, admitted 180,000 refugees. The historic average, 90,000 in President Trump's last year, 15,000, or 12,000 actually. And some of our sister agencies for resettlement had bigger hits than we did. I mean, they were less able to take the blows. So I think there's been serious degradation of the infrastructure, but the Biden administration, after a bit of a hiccup, has now committed to 62,000 target this year. It won't hit it, but it's stretching the system now. We're putting the rocket boosters back on. In terms of American leadership, I think that it has to be re-earned. And frankly, I found it quite hard in the last year, as I've been saying to people in Europe, look, you need a proper refugee resettlement scheme, because there isn't one of substantial size. Because look, the American, the Biden administration is coming back. It's a hard road now, because people don't know how long it's for, to be honest.
Yeah, that's
the thing. So I think that it's very sad that something that's bipartisan, as I say, Ronald Reagan was a big supporter of the refugee program. I'm sure there are many Republicans who interestingly enough, this is maybe rather cheering for you, for your former party. When President Trump, he both reduced the overall numbers, and he said, I'm going to require that every state and every city that wants to host refugees signs an affidavit saying it's okay. It was an invitation to block. Actually, before it went to court, 43 states said yes, including significant numbers of Republican states.
Yeah.
And that's good.
We're an immigrant country.
Yeah.
A question asked by Karen Brown, which actually I was going to ask at the end, but we'll put to you now. With the U.S. and other NATO countries' militaries leaving Afghanistan, what impact do you expect this to have on the refugee situation there? And I'd ask you to, expand on that, because you do have a pretty enviable record of being able to look a little bit further than other people on the consequences of major geopolitical events that then create these kinds of situations. So could you talk about that?
Yeah, so we have 1,100 staff in Afghanistan in 9 provinces, doing amazing work. 1,094 of them, I think, are Afghans, men and women, 44% women on our staff in Afghanistan, doing protection of women and girls, education, economic livelihoods programs, really, really impressive. And we're really concerned. I mean, there was an absolutely unspeakable bombing over the weekend, obviously, which everyone's seen in school. And we hear of different parts of the country tooling up for violence. We know that violence is rising. And we know that there's enormous pressure on the state machine and enormous pressure on state capacity. So we're obviously very, very concerned. I'm not trying to say that in a diplomatic way, but we're afraid for our staff and we're afraid for our clients. Now, the refugee situation, I mean, obviously there are, I think, still 750,000 refugees from Afghanistan in Iran, in the West. And there are still 2.5 million Afghans in Pakistan, some of whom have never lived in Afghanistan. And obviously the fear, I'm not the first person to float this, is that we get new refugee flows out of the country. And the country loses more talent, more people. And if you or I were living in Afghanistan at the moment, we'd be asking ourselves and our families hard questions, I know. So we're very committed to our work there. We've been working there for 40 plus years, and we've got an amazing team. We're trying to keep it going. The Biden administration has said it wants to keep its humanitarian work going, and one of the, I think, flaws of the last 20 years has been that I think I'm right in saying 84% of American aid to Afghanistan was security, and only 16% was on the development side. The European was flipped. The European numbers were flipped in the opposite direction. I was on something called the Afghan Study Group, which the US Institute of Peace convened, and I remember that statistic from there. So it seems a bit limp to say we're very concerned, but we're very concerned. And you know, Afghanistan has proved perilous for its own people and for outsiders, and I'm afraid it's going to be a very turbulent time ahead.
Yeah. Well, I'm afraid we're come to the end of our time. That was really an extraordinary conversation. Thank you for giving us the time. Thank you for the thoughtfulness and, you know, the mastery of the detail. And I will also thank you for the example you've set. You know, somebody who's been foreign secretary for 3 or 4 years could go out into the world of business and make a fortune. And instead, you've devoted the last 8 years or more to doing good.
7.5. So
7.5. Well, okay. That's a wonderful example to have set, particularly for our students. And I want to thank you for that.
Thank you
for your time. And I'll look forward to seeing you in person.
I look forward to it.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot, Elliot. Take care.